Well, we have the remnant here, and it's always interesting to finish out one of these series. It's just like these at academic meetings, except at the academic sessions, when you have the last word to say, it's usually about 5 or 6 people sitting out there. With regard to this material, you've already got a lot of stuff online. If you haven't gotten all the material or received all the material, be forewarned that you should go ahead and contact Renee and make sure that you're able to get it. This afternoon, the texts of the 3 presentations that I have given will be online, and I'll be updating those. There are a couple of little typos, particularly with regard to textual references that need to be cleaned up, but we thought we'd get those out as quickly as possible. So you'll be able to get those online this afternoon. And the whole series, my introduction, very brief introduction to Matthew, bibliography, then the text of my presentations, and then the 3 little postscripts on how to preach from these texts. And there's also a sermon that I preached there. So all of that material we'll have available, and if you can't get the links or the proper links, just check with Renee and she'll show you how to do it. Today I want to deal with Matthew 25, 31 through 46, the parable of the sheep and the goats. Most of us have lived with Matthew 25 for a long time. In the congregation which nourished me in Australia in my earlier years, we had little envelopes available in the back of the pew. Anyone who wished to give to social services or missions could use them at any time. Stamped across one of the envelopes for social services was the picture of a rather decrepit person and a verse from Matthew 25:40, of course in the King James Version. Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. These words were not only printed on the envelope, they have been imprinted in my memory ever since. And something like this is probably true for you today. So we've all been around the block with this parable. It is quite amazing to sense the degree that this verse and this vignette has become disconnected from the wider Christian story that informs the parable, at least in the minds of many in our culture. So it is no accident that people who claim that works of mercy done outside the zone of Christian faith are the most worthwhile and beneficial. It seems that people who do these works are to be most admired, presumably because they are reckoned to be spontaneous and not informed by religious faith. Indeed, the standard bearers of a certain kind of secularism, if they're interested in Jesus at all, will usually at this point co-opt him as the patron of those who generously show concern for the poor. That is what Christ was all about, they say. but that is as far as they will go. The ethically challenged businessman who never darkens a church door, but who hands out $50 to the man begging on the street corner. He is the one who is viewed as the genuine article. Not so long ago, I had a church member who had someone with him who did that, and he thought it was wonderful. With a wink and a nod, this kind of person's the good model. All on the basis of this reading of the text. So I've come regularly to expect to see and hear this perspective in our media and in general culture. But I was surprised when visiting out of town some years ago to hear this same sentiment in a sermon from one of our graduates, no less. This is a reminder that such a position is prevalent even in the church. That is, that spontaneous help for the poor is real Christianity. It represents real hands-on discipleship. Action counts. Connecting it with doctrine taints. But wait a minute. Given where this parable occurs in Matthew, this strikes me as a bit strange. After all, it does come immediately before the Passion account. Very important place in Matthew. It is the climactic ending to the teaching ministry of Jesus. It concludes the final section of 7 parables in Jesus' last discourse, which in turn function as the last of the famous discourses in Matthew, the heart and soul of his teaching. At least for Matthew, there could not be a teaching of Jesus more strategically placed to underscore the importance of his entire message. Thus, this particular unit is worthy of close attention. I think we're already getting a hint, just by the placement of this text in Matthew, that there is more to this parable than handing out $50 to the guy on the street corner. So let us start with the general context. As noted, this unit concludes Jesus' last discourse. In my book on this topic, I list Matthew's discourse as starting at 24:1. I am aware that others started as early as the critique of the Pharisees in chapter 23. Indeed, it is important for understanding this parable, and now I'll be working with this, to note what takes place before chapter 24. In the preceding chapters in Matthew, Jesus is busy giving a series of grave warnings to the leaders of Israel, urging them to repent. In Matthew 21:43, in the face of widespread rejection, Jesus tells these leaders, "The kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a nation," the Greek ethne, "producing fruits." Keep in mind, nation. Here the text is not referring to another nation state, but the kind of people to whom the kingdom would be given. Important. These are people, as we shall see, who above all heed the love command. They are the renewed people of God, the people that Matthew loves are those who heed the love command. In Matthew's world, they are the ones who, in hearing the message, will heed the call to flock to Zion in anticipation of the ultimate lordship of Jesus and the 12. They will replace the leadership of old Israel. Right at the end of the blistering critique of the Pharisees in Matthew 23, after the plaintive wail over the current leadership of Israel in Jerusalem, Jesus announces, "Behold, your house is forsaken and desolate." So they are to be replaced by the new nation. So it's clear from these words and many others that Jesus perceived that God's judgment was about to fall on the leadership of Israel. And this establishment was about to be replaced by the other people of 2143. Now, all that's a given. Moving over to the last discourse in Matthew 24 through 25, Matthew now turns to these other people. In short, people of the last days. We are not immune from the earlier critique of Israel because we are the other people. And that's where the focus comes in 24 and 25. The unit falls into two major sections. Chapter 24, 3 through 36. There is the discussion about the situation in Roman Greater Syria between the time of Jesus and the parousia of the Son of Man. Then Matthew 24, 37 through 25, 46 delivers, now we're coming home, 7 parables of warning to the people of the last days. Jesus' disciples need to be prepared and faithful in view of the coming judgment of the kingdom people at the parousia. These 7 parables of warning to the church, to us, balance off the 7 warnings to the Pharisees in chapter 23. Important. As already noted, the leaders of Israel were about to lose their place. This is underscored in the 7 warnings to the Pharisees. Likewise, in the 7 parables, and this is crucial, the people in the other nations, the church, are warned that unless they're prepared, a similar thing will happen to them at the parousia. In short, what I've been saying here for the last few minutes, to sum up, the parable of the sheep and the goats is not a series of piecemeal sayings detaching Jesus from the life of the church, as we like to do it in our culture today, and the impact of his total message. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Read in context, it's a warning to the church, just as the parables of the 10 virgins and talents do the same. In fact, it's similar to the other 6 parables. If the earliest church did not heed the message of this word, as I say, Matthew is the word of the pillars of the church, a similar thing would happen to them along the same line as happened to Jerusalem. 70. We'll say much more about this, but we can already say that though this parable is often read as moralistic advice to the Scrooges of society, give that guy the $50. We see that as a misreading. Matthew understands it clearly as Jesus' word to the church, although, as we shall see, it has implications for others as well. A couple of other important points are in order on context before we take up the parable itself. First, as many have observed, the parable seems to function as the other side of the coin to Jesus' address to the disciples about their mission to Israel in Matthew 10, 5 through 39. Our parable, Matthew 25, features a judgment scene of all nations. Of course, Matthew's mission discourse initially precludes the Gentiles. The focus is entirely on Israel. So let us talk about that for a bit. We have in Matthew 10:5, go nowhere among the Gentiles but to the lost sheep of Israel. The wide-scale rejection of Jesus by his own people when he enters Jerusalem is already then preceded by a long mission to them. Noticeably, this mission is carried out by the 12, who are pictured as remarkably vulnerable, important, and in need of hospitality from those who have received their message. Good to go back and read Matthew 10. 10:24 through 25 describes the disciples as embodying this vulnerability and values of the Master and their mission to Israel. In fact, the vulnerability of the 12 is described in 10:40 through 42, important words here, in words that are very close to what we find in Matthew 25. Whoever gives to one of these little ones, the vulnerable disciples, that is, even a cup of cold water because he is a disciple, truly I say to you, he shall not lose his reward. So Matthew 10 makes it very clear that when the Son of Man comes to his throne, those in Israel who showed hospitality to the disciples will be rewarded. They receive Jesus in his messengers. On the other hand, in characteristic Matthean terminology, for the others who rejected the messages, or the messengers, it will be much more tolerable for Sodom than for them. For in rejecting the disciples, they have not just rejected some emissaries, they have rejected the Master himself. My friend Peter Stuhlmacher points out that for Matthew, the disciples did not return. That mission to Israel is open. I believe it's still open today and continues, certainly for Matthew until the end of the age. Now, a little aside here. It's worthwhile to notice that even in this message to Israel, the messengers are not the ones who are judged. It is the recipients of the message themselves. Herein is an important lesson for us. Far too often in the church, we view ourselves as being judged by the world with respect to our authenticity. We spend far too much time, in my view, pausing and wondering whether we are meeting society's needs, and thus somehow being relevant. Now, I'm not wishing to be critical here, Yesterday we had a wonderful example at our luncheon of some people being salt and light to their community. But I do say that well over half the articles I see in the Christian Chronicle are of a special kind of vintage. A little congregation somewhere meets a societal need and gets 2 minutes on the evening news of the local TV station. And for this, we pat ourselves on the back. We are finally being relevant to the world. Let me say this. For Matthew, it is the opposite. Here, Israel, and later the nations, as we'll see in 25, and are to be judged by their response to the shepherd's message. We're not the ones who are being judged, they are. They are the ones on the line when we bring the knowledge of the judgment of Christ and the lordship. And we should learn from this. We're not running in announcing the lordship of Christ to Israel or to the nations for political office. We're not to frame our message either in the contours of the progressive or the conservative agenda for the culture. What we're to do is to announce that Christ is Lord. And the lordship of Christ will operate in the new order. So they ultimately are the ones on the line. Now, speaking about the nations, the central concern of Matthew 25, let us take a quick look at how Matthew brings them into the story so that we can understand the total setting in Matthew 25. They too did not just pop out of the air in Matthew. Here we have to be very brief. As early as 4:15, Jesus leaves Nazareth, comes to Capernaum. Echoing Isaiah 9, 1 through 2, he says, he's bringing a great light to Galilee of the Gentiles. As the hidden and suffering Son of Man who will be rejected and who will give his life for his people. In Matthew 12, 17 through 21, quoting the servant passage in Isaiah 42, he announces he's God's servant who will proclaim God's saving power. The heart of the announcement is that this is the time of justice that will emerge in the nations. There will be a time when God's righteousness and justice overcome the nations. Now, what is unusual about this reference is that it follows the mission discourse in the previous chapter, where you remember that the disciples were not to go to the Gentiles or nations. But of course, the word in Matthew 12 is anticipatory. He's anticipating that the word originally went to Israel will ultimately be taken to all nations, including Israel. It's made clear in 28, 16 through 20. So as Matthew moves on, the demand for righteousness for Israel is eventually extended to the nations. They must be brought the message. And the context of Matthew 24, 9 through 14 indicates it will not be an easy ride. That's where we are today. The mission to the nations will be bathed in persecution. But by Matthew 25, it is presumed to bear fruit. The mission of Matthew 28, 16 through 20 surfaces people, important point, who are prepared to fulfill the love command. And so when the Son of Man comes, those who hear the word, just like Matthew 10, and respond in keeping with the love commandment which is the foundation of all that I have commanded you in 28, will be rewarded. So at last, in conclusion here, we turn to Matthew 25, 31 through 46. Before we go into this text, it should be briefly noted that I take this unit to be a parable. A number of significant commentators have labeled this as an apocalyptic description of the final judgment, Graham, Stanton, Bultmann. But I'm constrained to refer to it as a parable, much the same way as we've been talking with the parables in Luke here, particularly the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16, 19 through 31, which, as you all know in the Church of Christ, is there's always somebody out there to say. It doesn't specifically say it's a parable. Both accounts are based on two vivid pictures. In the Lucan account, we have first the rich man blithely ignoring the beggar at his gates. Then we have the reversal of the situation in the hereafter. So in Matthew 25, we have also two pictures. First, we have a situation hardly worthy of notice to an ordinary Middle Eastern person. A shepherd is quietly preparing to give his mixed group of animals shelter for the evening. Hardly notice it. Just like you're driving off to Bastrop this afternoon and you see someone ploughing in the field. Just an ordinary, everyday event. Those who have witnessed this situation, though, tell us that the goats, usually a different color from the sheep, are brought inside, given shelter because they are less hardy on cold nights and tend to stray farther away. Yet oddly, those left outside the shelter, the sheep, are the ones who will become the analogues for vindication in the parable. So we have that little common everyday scene, hardly notice it. This is contrasted with the opposite picture, the judgment scene at the end of history. The two pictures could hardly be more different. The coming of the Son of Man is a matter of great fanfare. It is described as a king sitting on a glorious throne, allocating to various people the future of their eternal destinies. The interplay of these two pictures, I think, provide the basic framework for this account. I call it a parable because I think it is similar to the two previous parables of the wise and foolish virgins and the talents in Matthew 25, 1 through 30. Both of these parables are accounts of different groups of people who either are ready or not ready for the Son of Man's coming. As such, these parables, along with the sheep and the goats, provide a triad to end the last discourse. It gives additional instruction on what we need to be doing as we await the coming of the Son of Man at the end of the age. So the climax of the parable of the sheep and goats revolves now, at another important point, around the surprises at the judgment. What was done or not done by the nations to the least was also done to the Son of Man. 25:40. I want to explain this further, but for now it's simply worthwhile to point out that the whole function of the judgment scene is to give Matthew's hearers or readers a preliminary preview of what will happen at the last day. Here we're being sucked into the mystery in true parabolic fashion by listening into the preview of what will take place. We have the benefit of adjusting our lives so that we'll be able to adopt to the appropriate lifestyle to receive a favorable result. To me, this comes close to how parables are supposed to function. Thus I call it a parable. So if it is a parable, what is its point? What are we to be forewarned about? As we have already seen, the parable seeks to throw light on the nature of the final judgment. The first thing that must be learned is that this judgment is, in the last analysis, a judgment of individuals. Oh yes, the nation of Israel, as in various other times in its earlier history, according to the prophets, had come under Yahweh's wrath, had suffered punishment, and survived. But according to Matthew, once again, this has happened with their rejection of Jesus. The events of 70, their punishment, that the readers understand. That's a given. But at the last day, it will be different. All the nations will be assembled and will be held to everlasting account. Indeed, for them to be held accountable, it is important for Matthew that the word must be taken to them. Commission 28:16 through 20. But as H. Benedict Green has noted, a distinction must be made between nations and individuals. There's no indication in the New Testament that the nations will retain their ethnic identity at the end of the age. Nowhere do we learn that the Chinese will be admitted while the Australians are left out. That's not going to happen. When it comes to who will enter the kingdom or be consigned to the valley of Gehenna, it will be individuals. And for Matthew, that is where the focus of the parable rests. Whether one be Jew or Gentile, Matthew is saying that those who will enter the benefits of the new age are those to whom Jesus' word was taken and who acted with hospitality and compassion towards its messengers. On the other hand, and this is the real shocker, it is not only those in the nations who disregarded the word and who on various grounds will not be admitted to the kingdom, but as Green states, those among the membership of the church, the other nation of Matthew 21:43, who fail to recognize or serve Christ in the persons of their afflicted fellow disciple. As you, the fellow believer, did not, or did it not, to one of the least of these, Matthew's little ones, you did it not to me. Come to think about it, the more I contemplate this, it seems close to the point of the parable of the wheat and the tares. Our task in the family of God is to encourage, to nourish our fellow believers on the journey. We're doing that under Christ. We're to help that bearer and messenger of the word, that proclaimer, you who are out there today, who is bereft and discouraged for the stand that you are taking. This is our solemn responsibility. It sounds sentimental, but our hands are the hands of Jesus as we help our sisters and brothers or carry the word to a dying world. So I've given you my conclusions. But let me end the presentation today by underscoring the major exegetical reasons for this reading. The parable opens with the description of the scene at the final judgment. There are echoes in verse 31 of Daniel 7, especially Daniel 7:14. In Daniel, the Son of Man presides over Adam's restored dominion and dispenses it to the faithful Jewish resistors. In Matthew, the Son of Man will vindicate his disciples and will assist in the judging process. Before the Son of Man are gathered all the nations in the sense of all peoples. The extended metaphor of the shepherd separating the sheep from the goats in verses 32 through 33 indicate the authority of the Son of Man, now referred to as a king. Just as the shepherd knows how to do it, there's no hesitation as to his ability, or the Son of Man's ability, to dispense justice. Commencing in verse 35, verses 35 through 40 speak about those who are welcomed into the kingdom. Here, the focus is now clearly on the results of what the church is about today, the mission to the nations, in 28:16 through 20. W.D. Davies has drawn attention to an amazing parallel in the Midrash on Psalm 118:17. It is the last day when the judge will address the judge. The judged one is asked, "What has your work been?" If he then says, "I have fed the hungry," he is told to enter on into the kingdom. If he says, "I have given the thirsty to drink," then it will be said, "That is the gate of Yahweh, enter in." If he says, "I have clothed the naked," then it will be said, "Enter in." Additional points are made, concluding with a word about the works of love. I believe this latter reference is important for Matthew because obeying the love commandment is absolutely central for Matthew. When people of the nations encounter the Christian missionaries of the Messiah, inviting them to come to Zion and to accept his lordship, when they respond with the love commandment, then they will be well. If they respond with hospitality and works of love, they are welcomed into God's new world. What is astonishing in the parable is how far this goes. As we have noted, they are even called righteous, 25:37. But, and this is what is great about this parable, is the element of surprise. Now it becomes understandable. With their limited knowledge and hearing about the lordship of Christ and their need to respond to it, and they do, they are now stunned to know that in these vulnerable missionaries, these people who don't look very much like they know anything, who didn't seem to amount to anything. In them was the Son of God and King. Such is the nature of our and your mission here today. The reference to the least of these, my brethren, of course, has been much discussed. But analysis of the text makes it pretty clear. It's us, the vulnerable Christian missionaries, the same ones as 1042, doing their work there in the Jewish mission. In 1042, it was the one in Israel who gives a cup of cold water to a fellow disciple who is the one who is blessed. Now in 25:14, those from the nations are the ones who are blessed, who likewise do the works of love by extending hospitality to Jesus' brothers, the people of God, and heeding and obeying their word. The criterion for their vindication is not the romantic idea that somehow or other that Jesus is embodied in the poor of the world, and thus by being Bill Gates, they're doing the same great works of service commanded by Jesus. No, these who do the works of love are rewarded by those who extend the love commandment toward the marginalized and unrecognized disciple of Jesus, and so attest unconsciously to his lordship. Stunned in this new context, suddenly they discover he's not the crucified scoundrel that they'd heard about, but the Lord and King and ruler of God's new world. What a shocker. What a way for Matthew to introduce the Passion account. So this brings us to the final section of the unit, 41 through 46. And here we encounter those who are moved to the left hand of the King and are about to be consigned to the valley of Gehinnom. The salient issue is, who are these people? Our position is, they are not the people in the nations who rejected the word brought by the missionaries. There's no reason why such people should have any expectation of receiving praise for doing works of love from Jesus or anyone associated with him. They just blew it off. As many have noted, their reprobation is already sealed for other reasons. Rather, the ones who are the true focus of the word of condemnation are those people of the other nation. Some of those in the kingdom of God. They had heard the call of the Master, obeyed the gospel, but they became lax in service. Like the wicked servant earlier, the foolish virgins, and the slave who buried the entire talent given to him by his master, the people of the kingdom had become slothful. They had failed to show assistance and care for their fellow disciples. There was no fruit. Once again, the image of the shepherd in Matthew 18, going out to find the lost sheep as a model for discipleship, comes to mind. This is the cautionary word of forewarning to all who will hear this parable. Truly, I say to you, as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me. So, this parable is primarily, I think, a forewarning to the people of God. No doubt it is an uncomfortable word when it's spoken to little complacent church. There will be some who are absolutely convinced that as the elect, they have an ironclad claim on the ticket to the Messianic banquet. Matthew is a solemn reminder that there will be some disappointed amongst those who will be surprised on the last day. As ones who bear the burden of teaching and preaching to the people of God, we have a glorious task, as I have outlined here this morning. But we also have a solemn responsibility. Part of it is to keep in mind Matthew 25. We are to remind people of Jesus' last solemn word of warning before the Passion. Nowhere is this more applicable than as a word to elders and preachers in the church. Thank you on this last hour for your attention, and blessings to you in your future ministry.